lovely Monday. Yes, it's working. Thank you, Bite Mark, for your help just a second ago. Even though it wasn't really helpful, it was moral support, and I appreciate you. We have a guest today. This is Dr. Nicki Johnson. At this point, you need a checklist. I have a checklist. I went through the checklist, and then whenever I hit go live, it said, okay, you're live, and then all of a sudden it was like, no, actually you're not. I'm just kidding. I had to restart, and I had just restarted my computer because that's on my checklist. We have a wonderful guest today. Oh, and I need to reset my title also. Yes, that's true. That is true. You are here to answer the phone in proximity to the one that fixes. Absolutely. Let me set my title here. I do not have the soundboard commands working right now because that would be too much. That would be too much. Oh, but you know what? I don't have the... Okay. So I had to restart my computer, so of course everything else restarted. We're fine. It's all good. Chatbot will start up in just a second. And I'll be able to open the queue. But as we do whenever we have an actual professional guest here, hey Autumn, how are you? We will have a queue set up. So you can type !Q, just the letter Q. No need for all the silent letters, just the letter Q. We will have that opened up. And we will also have those questions. As you enter them, you can do one at a time, and you will make sure to answer those questions as we go, kind of thing. But our guest today, who's gracious enough to join us and thankfully has already stuck through several minutes of me going, oh shit, what's happening here, is Dr. Nicki Johnson, and her research interests. All right, let me pull this over here. Here we go. Include violence against women and sexual gender minorities with an emphasis on sexual violence and intimate partner violence, cultural reactions to gender-based violence, the evaluation of prevention program for gender-based violence, the analysis of sexism and gender inequalities within and outside of the U.S. She's assisted in the implementation of 2 shelter-based treatment programs for women with a history of intimate partner violence, as well as created a bystander-plus rape prevention program for college students, incorporating traditional bystander intervention techniques with feminist consciousness raising. She recently received NIH funding to develop and evaluate a multi-pronged intervention targeting risky alcohol use, risky sex, and bystander behavior associated with alcohol and sexual assault contexts. She employs both quantitative and qualitative research methods with a focus on mixed methodology. She's also received several awards for her work, including the 2018 American Psychological Association Laura Brown Award for Outstanding Contributions in LGBTQ Psychology, and the 2018 Zirkle Award for Distinguished Teaching Education, and the 2019 Outstanding Initiative Award for her LGBTQ plus focused rape prevention programming. She also directs the Resistance Lab, which I have a link for you right here. You want to check out the Resistance Lab, you can go there. She also directs the Resistance Lab at Lehigh University, which is dedicated to the eradication of gender-based violence through empirical research and programming. So thank you so much for joining us today. Super excited to have you here. We're going to be talking about gender-based violence today. This is it can be somewhat an intense topic, so if the conversation gets a little bit heavy, I think that's fine. Breathe in and out. Yeah, that was a mouthful. If the conversation gets a little bit tense, that's okay, because these are definitely things that we want to talk about. Definitely things that we want to make sure there is conversation around. So mental health is not always just talking about anxiety and depression, which are the kind of the fallbacks for mental health conversations are, okay, well, we're going to talk about depression. Okay, well, we're going to talk about anxiety, but there's so much more. It was a mouthful. It made me thirsty. Okay, so first of all, could you tell us what gender-based violence is and how common it is?
Sure. So gender-based violence is a term that was first kind of quoted by the United Nations. And what it means is any kind of violence that disproportionately affects individuals of a certain gender. And so oftentimes when we think about it, it can be synonymous with violence against women. So sexual assault, intimate partner violence are two forms of violence that are substantially more likely to occur against women. And also more recently, when we're actually looking at the trends, we see that gender and sexual minorities have increased risk of both intimate partner violence and sexual assault, as well as just violence based on homophobia and heterosexism. And so that's another class of individuals that fits within the gender-based violence scope. And so regards to commonality, it depends kind of on what context are we talking about, who are we talking about, but the numbers are alarmingly high, and regardless of what we're talking about. So when we look across the world, about 35% of women have experienced some form of physical or sexual violence. And that's a pretty alarming number when we think about women around the world. Kind of one of the numbers that sticks out the most to me when we think about prevalence is that 75% of bisexual women have experienced sexual violence within their life. And so wow. 75%, that's pretty alarming.
That is very alarming.
Yeah, so the numbers are high, but also widely varied depending on kind of who we're talking about and what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. That I know that it's hard to say kind of statistically because there's such a wide range of people that it affects, how many people it affects. So I appreciate you putting that into perspective a little bit, definitely. Can you tell us a little bit about the Resistance Lab?
Sure. So the Resistance Lab is my research lab, and they're wonderful. They're a bunch, right now, all of the members of the lab are my students. And we were coming up with a name, and I said, what do you think kind of captures what we do? And they were like, resisting. And so we came up with the Resistance Lab. And what we basically do is try and resist against violence. So we're really a lab that focuses on how do we create a culture that isn't violent, and particularly focused on gender-based violence. And so that's kind of where the Resistance Lab came from. And we focus on a lot of things. So obviously we're researchers, so we focus a lot on research and how to get the research, not just kind of sitting in our ivory tower and looking at the numbers and going, oh, this is interesting. But how do we get this to people, make it accessible, and make it something that people are interested in and want to hear about? So that's a big thing that we focus on. We're also all clinicians, and so thinking about how do we advocate for our clients, or how do we advocate for people in the community? How do we create policy change? How do we get resources to individuals? So a part of our website includes kind of resources that are either specific to certain groups or overall. So just having that access, we think, is really important.
So when you say that you focus on research and kind of getting out there versus just looking at the data, what does that look like in a typical research project? How do you go about that?
So the truth about research is that it's long and tedious, and a lot of time. So I'm working on a special issue right now for Women in Therapy, which is a really great journal that's focused on the Me Too movement and how the Me Too movement has impacted clinicians, clients, etc. And it's really exciting and very kind of in the forefront right now. But the truth is that it won't be published for about 2 years. And so it's this delayed process, right, of collecting the data and research can take, depending on how complicated your research project is, it can take a year to multiple years. And then the process of actually getting it published, going through peer review, can take another year. So the research idea you have then doesn't get out to even like a journal audience for several years. So what we do is we try to move things along quickly, but also try to use what we know or what we learn from our research before it necessarily gets published. So we work a lot with media outlets and Twitter and social media to try and say, like, what is the current stuff that's happening right now? What is the whether it's our media or research or media on our research, or whether it's media that relates to our research, how can we get it out to people and say, like, this is something that we support and this is something that we see happening.
Yeah, that's great. And I saw on your website that you have a whole section for the resistance pup. Is that your dog?
She is, yeah.
Okay.
She's my dog. She is adorable and lovely, and she's been our mascot, so she comes to lab meetings all the time, and it's just pretty wonderful.
That's okay. So it would be absolutely perfect if she was a lab at lab meetings, but
It would. It
she
really
is
would.
super cute. I just put a link in the chat. So if you guys want to look at the resistance pup, it's perfect. Yes, like it is perfect. Absolutely. I think it's wonderful that you have a mascot. Did you just bring her to work randomly one day, or?
I used to bring her to work a lot because I work a little bit far from where I live, and so I would be gone for long periods of time, and so I would bring her in, and she just kind of became a mascot for us. So
That's perfect. I love it.
yeah, and she's gone to a lot of protests with me. So
Yeah. I did see a photo of the puppy at a
yep,
protest with the signs and
yep,
everything. I thought that was fantastic.
yeah.
What are some of the biggest differences you've seen when it comes to sexism and gender inequalities within and then outside of the US?
So I think something interesting about when we look at kind of comparisons is we tend to focus a lot on the differences. So, oh, well, at least we're not having this experience. Like, at least women can vote here, or at least women can work here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's true. There are differences in terms of what freedoms we are allotted or what freedoms we have in certain places versus others. But to be honest, when we look at sexism, it's really a global phenomenon. And we see there's not really places that we can say, oh, this place, it's matriarchal. You know, women are really the ones in power and holding the stance. And so what we see is a lot of similarities, a lot of economic inequality around the world based on gender. We see a lot of violence statistics around the world based on gender. And so while it might look slightly different, and while some places might be what we might consider more progressive or more along the lines in terms of gaining equality, we really don't see equality anywhere, which is, again, pretty unfortunate.
Yeah. We could go back to Viking days.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like when we look at the research of like tribal times, is really when we saw the most equality
Yeah.
of people just being like, "Hey, we don't care what's going on. You know, we're here to make it work," and that's what it was about. So
Yeah. So a couple of the things in your bio talked about prevention programs for gender-based violence. So what does a prevention program specifically for gender-based violence consist of?
So there's a couple of different ways to look at prevention. So there's primary prevention, which is kind of the classic prevention that we think of, which is to stop something from happening. So an example of that would be like vaccinations. That's like a prevention program. And so when we think about prevention, primary prevention for gender-based violence, it's how do we stop this violence from occurring? So those really, we target like early ages. So looking at getting things into schools like kindergarten. The earlier that we can start talking about these things and start teaching kids consent and about equality and human decency, the better. And so that can really help us stop the pattern from starting. And that's kind of when we think about prevention programming, primary prevention. Secondary prevention is how do we catch it early and intervene quickly and intensely. So like screening procedures are an example of secondary prevention. But in gender-based violence, that would be like, how do we find people who are in crisis and get them the things that they need? So to prevent the development of post-traumatic stress disorder, things like that, or to stop re-victimization from happening. And then the third is tertiary, which is a lot of what we focus on in the psychological realm, which is after this has happened, and it's not kind of the crisis period, how do we prevent long-term negative consequences? So how do we help survivors be able to continue on with their lives in a healthy, positive way? So how do we help them be able to cope with what happened to them? And so that's a lot of what we think about is teaching individuals in the community for how do you support someone who's been through this? How do you help them? How do you not make it worse? Which is unfortunately, we see a lot of times that community, well-meaning people in the community can actually do more harm than good. And so some of those programs is what a tertiary prevention program might look like.
I think that's great. Yeah. So Autumn said teach them consent early and often. I think that's great. So I have a kindergarten child, and then I have two in this cat. I have two in 6th, 7th. Oh God, they're in 7th grade, and I have one who's a senior in high school as well. So kind of at those different ages, like what's something you would start in kindergarten, or what's something you would start kind of at a senior level that you might not start at a 7th grade level, and what's something at a 7th grade level you might not start at kindergarten level? Like, are there differences in, I guess, the age ranges that you tailor those to, and what does that kind of look like?
Yeah, so definitely you want to make it age appropriate. So, and in regards to age appropriate, I think a big thing is language. Mm-hmm. So how we talk about certain things is going to sound very different when we talk to a kindergartner versus when we talk to someone who's a senior, and versus someone in 7th grade. And so thinking about, what language you do. One thing we know about language, though, is something that has been sort of universally found is we want to refer to sex organs and body parts by their appropriate names. And so regardless of if they're in kindergarten or if they're a senior, we want to call a penis and vagina a vagina. Yeah. And so I think that's something to be clear about. But also when we're talking about consent, with a kindergartner, we might be talking about consent for a hug versus when we're talking about in 7th grade, we might be talking about consent in terms to maybe puberty or kissing or those kind of things. And then versus with a senior, we're going to be talking about consent in terms of sexual activity. And so I think the behaviors that maybe we highlight might be different, but really the messages we want to be consistent and clear.
No, I think that is a really good explanation of kind of the differences. Do you work directly with primary education schools to implement these programs? And have you found any that are resistant to those kinds of programming?
So I don't directly work with them, and that's actually something that I'm currently working to get in the works of. Most of the primary of my work has been in college campuses, in the military, and then just like general with adults. So most of my work has been, and a lot of what we're finding out is it's too late. One of the biggest things that we see, there's this thing called the red zone early in college. I don't know if you've heard of that before, but it's the first couple months of college, which are the highest periods of sexual assault. And so colleges are doing better. When I went to college, there was like nothing. And now we're doing better, right? There's this expectation that something happens in college, but if it's happening so quickly when they get to college, is it soon enough? It's not preventing. We're not getting that primary prevention that we really ultimately want to see. And so because of that, we're really starting to think about how can we start this earlier. A lot of the concern is what you brought up, though, is a lot of schools are resistant to talking about this stuff. And one of the reasons is there's this concern and this myth that if you talk about it, then it's going to happen, right?
Right.
And even though, we have stats to say that that's not true, but there's still that idea and that concern, or parents think, I don't know what you're going to be telling them and I want to be responsible for that, which again, depending on the program might be a fair thing. And so thinking about how do we get evidence-based programs in school. And there's a really excellent program that has actually age-specific modules from kindergarten through college is the Green Dot program, which is a bystander-oriented program that does excellent work and is evidence-based, and again, has very like appropriate language depending on the age group. So that's something that I think.
And it's the Green Dot program?
Green Dot, yeah.
Okay. It's all right.
Yeah.
I write stuff down when I do. I write stuff down that I want to go and look up more information about after. So if you see me just kind of looking down and writing something, that's what I'm doing. Yeah, I mean, I can imagine, schools it took long enough to get them to just teach sex ed kind of thing. And we see the same thing with suicide in general. Like, one of the things that I've learned that was actually a little bit surprising to me was that a lot of people felt like if you talk to someone and ask them, are you thinking of committing suicide, that you are then going to be introducing that idea to them. And one of the things that I've learned since I started doing all this mental health talk show is just that it's not actually really the case. And in fact, and this is the part that I learned, like I knew that wasn't the case already, but the part that I learned is that asking someone that straightforward, asking them straight out, like, are you thinking of doing this, actually gives them kind of a release valve to talk about it. So
yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't know how we tied that into Suicide Prevention Week.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So can you describe, you mentioned the bystander piece of a prevention program. So you also have some material out there about a bystander-plus rape prevention program. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the best evidence that we have so far in terms of rape prevention is bystander programming, which basically means that we used to go through this whole route of teaching women how not to get raped and teaching men how not to rape. And that didn't go very well. It turns out that when people are confronted with this idea that they could be a rapist or somebody who's raped, they tend to get defensive and shut down. And actually, we saw this rebound effect happen where people endorsed greater rape myths after going through programming. Wow. And so this is why I'm like very big believer in assessing what you're doing, because we think things are like, oh, common sense, but then we figure out, oh, actually it's not. So bystander is one of the only programming that we have that actually has evidence to show long-standing changes. And so it's a great program, and what it does is it twists things, and it says, rather than you could be raped or you could be a rapist, it says, how can you be a proactive bystander? If you see something happening, how can you intervene in a helpful way? And what it does is it indirectly gets to that message of, if this could happen to you, or if you could be somebody who could do this, how do you intervene on your own behalf? But it really reduced that defensiveness. The problem is that it's really oftentimes like a one-time program, and we live in this culture that really reinforces these ideas about what it means to be a man and a woman, and what sex means, or not talking about sex, or the stigma around it. And so my argument for the bystander plus is that one-time programming isn't going to change a lifetime of culture. And so if we really want to create change, and change that's actually going to result in lower sexual assaults, then we need to start changing policy. We need to have more than just a one-time program. We need to raise consciousness. So we focus on consciousness raising, talking about this stuff, talking about the culture that we live in, so that people can be aware of it and then be different, choose different. And so that's really what the plus stands for, is this is great, and it's nice to see this initial effect. But if we actually want to create a culture of change, we need to do a whole lot more than a one-time program during college.
Yeah. And have you been able to get any colleges to implement more than a one-time, and how has that gone so far?
We have, yeah, we've had a couple of colleges that we've worked with in implementing this, and we have an article that recently got published online that looks at the two-prong approach, so having sort of a bystander-oriented program and then a consciousness raising. And we do see in our sample, which is one sample, so take it for what it is, but that we do see for individuals who go through this programming, they have reduced acceptance of rape culture, both within themselves as well as in their culture. And so trying to shift this cultural change with this, and we see positive results with that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, even, I know that you say there's only, the one sample, but the nice part about that is if someone else says, oh, well, they only have one sample, it's like, okay, then you go do it too. And now then we'll have two.
Exactly. Yeah.
You got to start somewhere.
Right. That's the beauty of science, right? It's like this idea of we take one brick and we're building a house, right? But one brick at a time. So.
Yeah. Yep. I like it. Slay, that's a really good point. Slay said a lot of the issues around mental health seem to be about long-held misconceptions that have been induced into facts because not enough people have been shutting them down early. Yeah.
So true. Yeah.
That is very true.
Yeah.
So in your bio earlier that I read, you received a couple of awards for LGBTQ plus research and programming. Can you describe some of the differences between rape prevention for LGBTQIA plus individuals?
Sure. So to be honest, there's not a lot out there. So most of the rape prevention programs are very heteronormative in nature. And so they focus almost exclusively on heterosexual relationships, and almost exclusively on the idea that a man is the perpetrator and a woman is a victim. And while we know that that is the most common occurrence, and so something that we don't want to say, like, let's not talk about that, there's also instances of that not being the situation. So men can be victims of sexual assault. Right. Individuals who identify as non-binary can be victims. And so women can be perpetrators. So really, when we think about being more inclusive in our programming or direct in our programming, we have to expand how we talk about this. So we actually took, and we have an article that just got accepted on this, but looks at creating a program for the queer community. And so what we did is we took our conscious raising program and we went to individuals who are programmers, so people who are on college campuses who do the programming, and said, what do you think about this? How do you think we can be more inclusive, as well as queer students, to see what do you think is missing? How can we make this more inclusive and more representative of your experiences and your culture? And so that's sort of the initial and the first program that we've seen that directly addresses or even tries to adapt to be specific to LGBTQ individuals. And for us, how we did that was to again be more inclusive in our language. And so rather than just talking about male, female, to talk about the rainbow of options. As well as also to talk about heterosexism. And so bring that into the conversation. So we talk about sexism a lot in rape prevention programming, but also bringing in the added layer of heterosexism and how queer individuals are often targeted because of our queer identity. And so bringing that into the mix is another kind of key difference. Something else we see is that a lot of queer individuals are targeted by non-queer people. And so thinking about who we might need to target from prevention isn't necessarily within the queer community, but outside of the queer community. So I think that's something that can sometimes be different as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we have a first question in the queue.
Sure.
What kind of plan is that behind you?
Oh, good question. It is, oh gosh, I always get this wrong. Hold on, it's I always want to call it a sage plant, but it's not a sage. It is a jade. That's what it is.
Sage? Jade. Oh, jade?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right.
It is a jade.
Hey, Al, how are you doing? Well, it's a very pretty plant. I like
Thank
it. You. So your statistic earlier, I just kind of want to go back to that because that did surprise me. Oh yes, Bite Mark said we're not going to grade you. I just wanted to know. Good, valid point. There is always a chance with me. You just don't know. I want to go back to a statistic that you mentioned in the beginning because it was really pretty shocking to me. But you said that 75% of bisexual individuals have experienced some sort of gender violence.
Mm-hmm.
That's like mind-blowingly high to me.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's and there's a national representative survey on intimate partner violence and sexual violence that for the first time in 2010 actually looked at sexual orientation. And they found that 75% of bisexual women had reported experiencing some form of sexual violence. And yeah, it's astronomical, and just shows. And when we've actually done some further sampling, and we find pretty similar statistics when we look at other samples. And so it seems like something that's really overwhelming. And my student and I actually wrote an article for the Journal of Bisexuality that postulates or hypothesizes some ideas for why that might be. And so some of the things that we highlighted is biphobia. So so we talked about heterosexism or homophobia, but there's a particular sort of mistrust or objectification of bisexual individuals, in particular bisexual women. And so this sort of objectification of bisexual women being engaging in same-sex relations for the pleasure of men. And so we see this a lot in pornography, and sometimes even in shows, or there's this concept of performative bisexuality, of girls kissing for the attention of boys, of girls gone wild kind of stuff. And so that sort of highlights this position of further objectification. And then there's the not only rejection from the heterosexual community, but also rejection from within the queer community of bisexual individuals. And so that kind of further rejection is another hypothesized reason. Alcohol is always a big factor, and we know that there's higher rates of substance use within the queer community, so that's another hypothesis. And then just good old-fashioned sexism. So.
Yeah. Good old-fashioned sexism. That's sad but true.
Yeah.
Bite has a question: what programs are available for people of college age but who do not attend college? Is there any outreach to places like libraries, community centers, etc.?
That's a great question. And actually, although the majority of programs and focus has been on college students, there is programming available. So Green Dot's program does it like in a variety of sets. I have a lot of positive things to say about them, obviously, but they definitely have their program accessible at various locations. So not just within college, but and their goal is really to have this be a lifelong experience. So thinking about something everybody has access to, like public education. But then also a lot of centers. So here in where I live, there's a really great, there's a place called Crime Victims Council that does outreach programming. And so they do outreach programming to anybody who asks. So that can sometimes be at libraries or at various sort of people might have groups or organizations within the community that they have them come and do prevention programming to, but it's often on a sort of requested basis rather than a regular sort of scheduled basis.
Yeah.
There are definitely programs and access. It's just sometimes something that has to be looked for, unfortunately.
Right. Which doesn't really speak to prevention.
No.
I mean, that seems to make it a much more reactionary stance at that point.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, Alex, is your question about the sample? What's your? I missed the sample size question. I don't remember what that's in relation to. If you can clarify what you're asking about. Oh, the 75%. Okay. Is the 75% number? Is that from the U.S.? Oh, you said it's from a national survey for partner violence?
Yeah.
So it's U.S. only?
U.S. national survey. So it was, what they do is they do this thing called they pick random places to call, and then they speak to whoever will answer, but they go until they get a nationally representative sample.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's just U.S. representation.
Yeah. And Bite said, honestly, I'd say that tracks with my experience and those around me. That's just ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
That really kind of makes me mad.
Yeah. I mean, it's something to be mad about for sure.
Yeah. Autumn said anti-trans bias and transphobia. My cat's ringing a bell. So you mentioned heterosexism and homophobia. Are those the same? I have not heard the term heterosexism before.
So they're often used interchangeably. Oftentimes when we think of homophobia, it's like a fear of gay individuals, whereas heterosexism is more about the systemic problem around it, so the cultural bias against it. So they're used interchangeably, but they have slightly different connotations. So one's about sort of fear, and the other one's about like the system.
Okay, I like it. Like cissexism.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah,
exactly.
that's another one I haven't heard either. Okay, so changing kind of questions a little bit, but in instances of partner abuse,
Mm-hmm.
where you're in a relationship, whether it's a heterosexual relationship, whether it's a any other rainbow of relationship. So a lot of people who hear about or read about someone who is in an abusive relationship, they wind up blaming the victim for not leaving, or saying, well, why didn't they just leave? If stuff got that bad, why didn't they just leave? Can you describe for us some of the barriers to leaving abusive relationships that aren't often talked about in those situations?
Sure. So I came up with this thing that I called the fairy tale theory of intimate partner violence. And so what I mean by this is oftentimes what we learn about, read about, hear about growing up is really paints a picture of the early stages of intimate partner violence. So like I'll tell you a little story of there's this individual, and she meets the love of her life, right? She's never felt this way before. She's never been so in love. She wants to spend all of her time with this partner. And so she starts spending all of her time and isolating herself from other people. And then her family and friends start to say, like, oh, it seems like you're spending a lot of time with that person. And then her partner starts to say, oh, they're just jealous and they don't understand our love, which then pulls her farther and farther away from her support. Then her activities and job starts getting in the way, and so her partner says, oh, I'll take care of you, don't worry, so then she becomes financially restricted and isolated with this person. Oftentimes abusers will remove the person from their location, so that might even be like moving to a different state. And so there's this burden. And so then at that point, right after they're isolated, financially restricted, don't have a support system to turn to, then that's when the first incidents of abuse will happen. And then they're so sorry and it'll never happen again. And it was just because they loved you so much. And so that's kind of this thing we call gaslighting, right? Where the abusive partner turns the situation on the other individual, making them feel like it's something they did wrong. And so at this point, you're isolated, you don't have anybody to turn to, you have no financial support. And so you believe them, and they're the love of your life, right? They're rescuing you from all the turmoils of your life, right? The thing that you've been missing. And so you forgive them, and then the abuse continues, and then they apologize. If only you wouldn't have done this thing, if only you would have had dinner ready, right? It becomes all of these things. And so then your self-worth really gets warped down, and you start to see yourself as this, if only I would be different, then they wouldn't hit me, or they wouldn't treat me this way, right? And so it becomes about you, not about them. And so at that point, there's just all of this stuff that makes it so hard to even realize that you're a victim. And so then at that point, if you even realize that you're a victim, something that you know is that the highest risk of violence, so the most likely time an individual is murdered by their partner, is when they leave. So not even talking about financial factors or not having support or not having anyone to turn to, but the highest risk of being killed is when you try and leave.
Wow.
And so that's a huge factor of why people stay, right? Well, if I leave, then I might die. Yeah. And so that's one of the things that I think for me in working with survivors is like a big take home message of when people say, well, why don't you leave? Well, it might actually be safer for me to stay, to be honest. And the state of our access to resources, the state of protection is not great for survivors. And so this whole idea of, well, just get a protection order. I can't tell you how many survivors have said it's a piece of paper.
Yeah, it's not going to stop anything.
What is that piece of paper going to do, right? So, this whole, it's a dangerous time period. And I am in awe of the individuals who have the strength and can figure out how to leave, because it is hard. It is so hard on all of those levels, again, of not having support, not having anyone to turn to. Oftentimes when you do turn to people, they say, well, why didn't you leave sooner? Or, maybe it's not that bad, right? Or what did you do to make that person react that way, right? So there's all of this victim blame, even if you do turn to support, and services also aren't equipped to help you or support you either. So it's a really isolating, terrible experience, and there's so many reasons why a person wouldn't leave.
Yeah, that's so there's a World Health Organization has a statistic out there. It's something like 47%, 48% of all women who are murdered are actually murdered by their intimate partner or family member.
Yeah.
So does the piece that you talked about, where kind of the highest risk is in leaving, does that stand for psychological abuse as well, or is that mostly in physical abuse situations? If they make that delineation, even.
Yeah, it's hard to, because they often are so entwined together. I would say that the partner probably, I don't know anything that specifically looks at whether the risk of possible murder or violence and psychological. I do know that if you try and leave, or if you do leave a psychologically abusive, psychological abuse goes up. So whatever it is, it intensifies.
Yeah.
Right. There's this peak period that happens after that. There's oftentimes also abusers will use tactics of threatening to harm themselves. So that's a really common tactic too, which is super hard, because again, it's so easy to villainize, like, well, they're terrible, but you love that person, right? And so if that person who you love and who has kind of really messed with you over how long you've been together threatens to harm themselves, that's something serious and something to think about, like, how would I feel? Because often it's like, I would kill myself if you leave me. So that's another, like, that's a psychological manipulation that's often used and can be very successful, because that's a really hard thing to have to face.
Right. Relationship coma. Autumn, that's an interesting. Why do y'all have so many terms that I've never heard of? Every time we do one of these, I learn something, which is good. That's a good thing. Like, I mean, always learn. Frost says, I don't want to sound creepy, but I love the aesthetic of your home.
Oh, thank you.
So we got questions about your plants, and you have a lovely home.
I do. I love it's very, very comfortable here.
Yeah. I learn at least 2 somethings when we do these. That's good, Alex. That's good. Just get a restraining order, which will help after they violate it. Yeah. Yes. I mean, restraining orders, they just don't do anything. Like, yeah, there's a threat of they could go, they could be held in contempt of court, but like there was always the chance that they could go to jail when they were doing these things anyway. So right. How big of a threat is that? Like, it's just not. Crimes of passion many times get leniency because the court, by the court, because their mental state was altered due to the circumstances they claim. Mm-hmm. That's a good point too. Well, and then I know that if you're in an abusive relationship, you're twice as likely to so I think this is only women. But you're twice as likely to experience depression, which then makes it harder to do a lot of things, Yeah. So there's that too. Like, it's all just
super it's way more complicated than we want to make it.
Yeah, it really is. And I think you're also twice as likely to have substance abuse as well. Yeah, just like there's so many complicating factors. It drives me crazy when I hear things like, well, why didn't you just leave? You know, that's not, it's not that simple.
It's not, definitely not that simple.
Yeah. So if you know someone who is in an abusive relationship, is there something that you can say or that you can do that actually is helpful?
Sure.
Besides saying, well, why don't you just leave?
Definitely don't say that. Yeah, I'd say to be helpful, don't say that.
Yeah.
But I think kind of the biggest thing is to believe them and ask them
Yes.
what they need. I think those are kind of my two biggest things of believe the person and ask them what they need. Outside of that, I think another thing that you could do is come up with like a safety plan or some kind of code with them so that if they're in trouble, they can call you and say something. And then that means you need to call the police or you need to come get the kids. So coming up with them of what is a plan that would be helpful for them. I think it's, you know, there's an inclination for us to want to encourage them to leave. And I think, of course, supporting them in that is great. But a lot of times encouraging them to leave, again, takes out all of those factors that we just talked about. And oftentimes, growing up in this culture can read as blame. Like, why don't you just, or why have. So I think avoiding that and just saying, like, what do you need? What can I do for you? And being there for them, I think are really the biggest things, because a big factor of abuse is that social isolation. So how can you be there for them to help them not be socially isolated?
Yeah. Yeah, Autumn, how can I help you? That's we've talked about the how can I help you plan when it comes to a lot of different things. Like whenever you're not having a super terrible bad day, just talking to your social connections and talking to your support system about how they can help you when you are having a shit day. Like that, I think that applies here too. It's I think that that's really helpful. And yeah, Alex, a bug out plan. Now you sound like a prepper. Okay. But a bug out plan might not be, thank you so much for that raid, Amalia. How are you doing? Hello. You know, a bug out plan doesn't have to be a you should get out plan, but like, you know, like you said, it could be just the, do you want me to come get the kids? Do you need me to do this? Do you want me to come over? You know, what can I do to help you in this moment? What can I do to help you in a typical moment that you might need? But yeah, I think that's great. Bitemark said, one of the most eye-opening moments for me was when someone said that abusers threatening to harm themselves if you leave is holding themselves hostage, and we do not negotiate with terrorists. Hey, I like it.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I think that's good. I'm doing great, Amalia. Thank you. I know how you feel. This can get better. I know that you feel this can get better, but if it doesn't, can we at least have a code word you can text me and I'll come get you no matter what? That's a great question too. That's a really good thing too. And I've heard that with your kids too. Like if you set something up with your kids where they're at a party and they you know, instead of calling me mom, you know, maybe they call me mommy or something, and they say, "Mommy, can I please stay?" And you're like, "Nope. Sorry, you gotta come home." You know, and I've told my kids before, like, make me out to be the bad guy. I don't care. You know, I have no skin in your friendships.
Absolutely.
If I need to be the bad guy and say that you need to come home because you got to clean your room, like, I'll do that. I don't mind. You talk to your kiddo about that. That's great. Yes, yeah. Having a system like that, I think, is really helpful. And I didn't think about it in that context of a friend who might be in an abusive relationship. I think that's great. I think that's wonderful as well. You mentioned something earlier about kind of the onus being on. So this isn't really about abusive relationships. It goes back more on the gender violence side, which I like. They're connected, right? But there's especially on Twitch, there's a huge culture of harassment and abuse online too, and then also just across gaming in general. If you are a woman, if you let it be known that you are a woman or a girl, like you're a lot of the time pressured to leave that platform, you're pressured to self-censor, and then if you don't do those things, it's like, well, look at what you were wearing. You know, it kind of goes back to the rape culture piece. So instead of the perpetrators having that onus to change, it's on the person who is being harassed or being abused. Have there been any programs with companies that have mainly an online presence versus a physical campus presence to implement some of those programs? Not necessarily Twitch, but just like, is there anything? Anything.
That's a great question. I don't know of anything there's definitely programs that are like online programs, but they usually use scenarios of in-person scenarios. So again, like, you get that access, but in terms of talking about how to deal with it online, I don't know of anything like that, but that I think is super important and something that, again, people are probably studying right now, but we won't find out about it for several years, because it's definitely a relevant and timely factor, and I think really important for us to consider and think about the harassment that's going on online.
Yeah, it's something that I've experienced personally because I game. Like, I'm on Twitch. I don't get except for trolls every now and then. Like, I don't get any harassment on Twitch. Thank goodness, because I'm just like, huh? What are you talking about? But in games especially, it's like, oh, you're a girl, and like they just say the most ridiculously bizarre things, and you're like, who raised you?
Yeah.
What is going on? Can I call your mother?
Yeah, well, there's definitely some research that shows how people say the things they say online are things that they would never ever say in person.
Oh, yeah.
That's definitely something that shows the importance of why we need to study this.
Yeah. We do love trolls here, Alex. It's true. Yeah, he said we love trolls here. We humanize them and then they leave. It's true. We're just like, look, I'm sorry you're going through something today, but if you need to get it out, just get it out. And like 90% of the time, they're just like, oh, bye. It's pretty good. I would laugh so hard if my kid said, sorry, I gotta go home, guys. You know, my dad can be a bitch sometimes. Hey, that's fine. Everyone's tough until the trans woman is taller and is not having your harassment. Hey, you know what? Yes. Absolutely. So your focus in mental health research and this programming space on gender-based violence in particular doesn't sound like something that would be easily drawn to or that's easy to decide on. So what inspired you and why do you do what you do?
Yeah, so I've always been really interested in the cycle of violence. So something that we hear a lot in research is how individuals who perpetrate violence later in life often were either exposed to domestic violence or experienced abuse as a child. And so I started being very interested in that and actually wanted to work with perpetrators. And then when I was in college, it was sort of the beginning of talking about, oh, we should be talking about this stuff. This stuff's important. And so I got involved in a feminist organization that started doing like Take Back the Night and things like that. And I was like, oh, this is really important. And so I got really passionate and involved in that regards. And then I ended up going to my doctorate program and working with someone who was working in shelters with women who've been abused. And kind of the first time that I went into the shelter and started working with these amazing individuals, I was like, this is what I have to do. This is my future. This is what I need to do. And it's hard. You see a lot of things, you deal with a lot of things that a lot of people mostly choose to avoid. Some people who have the option to choose to avoid or ignore. And so it can be hard. And so I think I practice a lot of self-care. I go to my own counseling. I think counseling is so important. And so I think those are the ways that I deal with it, but it's really a passion to me and something I think is just really important. I really truly believe that we all believe to feel safe, and that's not something that a lot of oppressed and marginalized individuals feel, or most, I would go to say, and that's not something I feel okay with. And so trying to figure out how I can at least make one person feel safe is something that's worthwhile to me.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And, you know, what a goal. I mean, it's trying to make people feel safe. Like that's a pretty big goal. And I'm sure a lot of your research really supports that for sure. I mean, you have a resistance pup. Who doesn't feel safer with a resistance pup?
Right? Yeah. She's my self-soothing object.
Yes,
for
absolutely. Look, 3 cats, 3 dogs. I
sure.
have.
Yeah.
I'm with you. So you talked a little bit about working with the military. Is it hugely different to work with the military on some of these prevention programs versus college campuses? Is that a big difference? Or are there some similarities there?
I would say there's quite a bit of overlap. I think we talk about college campuses as like this progressive sort of place, and it can be like there's a lot of really cool stuff happening and a lot of like conscious raising happening in classes, and it definitely can be, but it's super hierarchical. There's so much hierarchy and so much institutional pressure to protect the name and make money. And so with that comes the same things that you see in the military of wanting to cover up things, wanting to silence people. And wanting to like cater to the people who have money, which are often people who aren't necessarily in favor of some of these more progressive things. So I really do see a lot of overlap. The biggest difference that I would say I see, and maybe something that kind of amplifies this in the military, is the emphasis on violence and dehumanization in the military, and that's just going to increase that tenfold, and also the overwhelming presence of males in the military, and violence and aggression is much more accepted in men, and so we see very high rates of male sexual trauma in the military, and it's the percentage is much higher for women in the military, but if we look at sheer numbers, it actually averages out with more men experiencing sexual violence, because there's just like 90% of our military is men. So I think that's also something that makes it quite different, is the high numbers that we see on college campuses is against women, whereas in the military it's really a lot of men experiencing sexual trauma. So but there's again that same kind of silencing and that we see in both systems, and this hierarchy that really tries to protect the institution over the individual.
Right. Oh no, I had another question and now it's gone. It will come back to me. It will come back. It will come back. Wait. Oh shoot. And of course it was a good one too. You know. This is what happens when I don't jot it down. Oh, I just forget. That's okay. Okay. No, it's gone.
That's okay.
I don't know where it went. So if you could change one thing about the mental health field or people's views of mental health professionals, what would it be?
I think if I could change something about the mental health field, I would make it universally accessible. I think that a big barrier to mental health is the cost and access, and also this idea that you have to be in crisis or have a severe mental health diagnosis to benefit from counseling. I think everyone can benefit from counseling. And I think changing something about mental health professionals is that we're human too. And we, a lot of us need the same kind of things that our clients need. And so I think maybe moving some of that kind of like power or that differential factor.
Yeah. All right. I do remember my other question.
Oh, great.
So you mentioned some of your work to do some research on the Me Too movement. Is that, thank you, Have, is that something that is, and I guess this is for all of your research as well, is that pretty scoped to the US, or do you do research in other countries as well?
So the majority of my research has focused in the US, but I am working with some partners right now to try and get access to look outside of the US. But right now, the Me Too movement, our research is focused on the US.
Do you find when you do research on something like the Me Too movement, do you find that the response to it coming out, you know, like you said, it takes a couple years to get some of these things done. Do you find that the response to it is quite different from when the movement was happening versus when the research comes out?
I think so. Yeah, I definitely think so, because it's sort of this like, oh, that was several years ago. So we just had something published that was about the 2016 presidential election. And while it was happening,
That.
it was all anybody could talk about,
Yes.
right? It was like, oh my gosh. And then now we're in 2019 and people are like, listen, we're focused on the 2020 election. And we're like, but it's just coming out now.
Yes.
So I think, unfortunately, it's like that was a big thing, right? Having the first female nominee of a major party, and the things that happened during that time were huge deals during that time. And now, like 3 years later, we're sort of moved on to the next thing. And so, unfortunately, I do think that it's an unfortunate factor of the fact that science takes time. And there's reasons for that, right? We don't want to be publishing things that haven't gone through a rigorous process. But it's sort of like then gets us behind the curve, and there's less sort of momentum behind it.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that helps you build on other research, like just like you said, that one brick at a time piece, the taking it and then saying, okay, well, we could do other things on this, or this wasn't quite clear, we need to do more research on this. I would hope that that's a good thing to come out of this, but I haven't read that election study yet, and we don't like to get too political here, but can you just kind of give us maybe summarize the abstract of it?
Sure. So basically, what we were interested in is, and to not be political at all, we were talking about how both of the two primary candidates, so Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, both were kind of surrounded by conversation around sexual violence. And so with the accusations against Bill Clinton and Hillary's proposed like victim blaming and silencing. So there was conversation around her, as well as conversation around Donald Trump with some of the accusations against him. And so we thought that people who were following the campaign would actually endorse higher rates of rape culture, the post-election sample versus the pre-election sample, just because it was really a focus of the campaign across sides. And so that was really what we were looking at. And we saw differences in a couple of things. So we saw increased acceptance of violence in the post-sample versus the pre-sample, as well as decreased acceptance of traditional gender roles. And we thought that was because of having the first female president. So we see this kind of like positive thing happening and this negative thing happening.
Right.
But basically what it tells us is that political campaigns have an influence on the culture. And then we looked at voting, and we saw some differences based on who people voted for in terms of acceptance of rape culture, with individuals who voted for Trump having more acceptance of rape culture than individuals who voted for Hillary. So, it's interesting, and it just kind of shows politics, and this kind of idea of the personal is political is a big thing that I'm a big believer in.
Yeah, absolutely. Alex says my family goes to therapy to make sure we get an external perspective on how we are growing our relationships. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we've said it before, and I'm sure we'll say it many, many times again, but I don't think there's anybody who, at least every now and then, couldn't benefit from some therapy. I was actually just talking to a friend about that over the weekend, and I was like, it doesn't hurt if you're already considering it. Like, it literally will not hurt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, my next question is not related to anything that we've talked about so far or your specialty. I'm just curious. And it's not about plants or your house either, so this is totally off topic. Do you happen to have a favorite serial killer?
Oh.
And I'll tell you why I asked that.
So I'm actually a true crime junkie. So
okay. All right. That's just, you know what? Our sample size is getting bigger. So the very first guest that I had on here, she talked about, I don't even remember how it came up. She talked about having a favorite serial killer, and that she's convinced that a lot of people who work in the mental health space actually do have, a favorite serial killer, or they are kind of true crime junkies. And then my next guest also had a favorite serial killer, and so I was just curious.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a favorite. I think maybe the most interesting to me is Ted Bundy. So
okay,
I would say just like his he was like very, very clearly problematically narcissistic. So you just like had this ability to really fool people. So
yeah. Autumn said, I don't have a choice about being involved in politics when considering just walking down the street or going to the grocery store is a political act. I can understand that. I can understand that, Autumn, for sure. Mm-hmm. It's I wish that everyone would understand that they don't have a choice. I wish that everyone would feel like they don't have a choice in whether or not to get involved in politics. But especially for the trans community, like there is no choice. That you're just involved.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No choice. If anybody else has any other questions, you're welcome to ask them. We do still have the queue open, and while we're waiting on that, is there anything you would like to throw out there about your work, or any shout outs, or anything we didn't cover that you want to talk about?
I think, kind of speaking of the trans community, I think that's one thing, that's another statistic that I think we really need to think about and talk about, is just the number of especially trans women of color, who've been murdered. So in thinking about gender-based violence, it's a huge topic that has not been given enough attention, and is thankfully again starting to, but we likely won't see that for a long time. But remember, one of the things that when working with the military is that the rate of trans individuals who were murdered in combat was lower than they were murdered in civilian life. And so we think about war as a place where you kind of go expecting that, but that it's not really, that's not the higher risk. The higher risk is just walking down the street. So I think another important thing for us to think about. And again, talking about safety, like it's just something that is not afforded to many individuals.
So that's actually pretty sickening. Like, more people in the military or fewer people in the military who are trans died in combat than just out and about living their lives. Yeah. Wow. 18 this year that you know of, Autumn. Wow. Yeah. Oh, that's so, people are so... One of them, Tracy Single, was a member of the local community. Oh, really? Wow. Ugh. That's just so, like, I don't understand how people can be so hateful about things that have literally zero impact on them. Yeah. Just live your life and let other people live their lives, man. Come on. Well, I appreciate fear and ignorance. That's true. I take back my statement. I do understand.
Fear is a very powerful thing. It really is.
It is. It is, but like if you're afraid of something that you don't know anything about, educate yourself.
Yeah.
And then you're taking care of both things.
Yep.
Well, I appreciate you being here today. If there are no other questions or anything, so I know that you're on Twitter. Let me throw out your Twitter here. And if y'all are interested in some of these studies and everything that Dr. Johnson mentioned, I kept my little list. And I also just wrote on my hand, so that's fun. And I will be putting those into the description and everything as well. I had your Twitter right in front of me. It was probably before I had to restart. Here it is. Probably before I had to restart my computer. Here are a couple things for you to follow, and don't forget to check out the Resistance Pup. Like,
she's pretty good.
Thank you, Autumn. Look at you. Y'all are on top of it. This is why I love you guys. Well, thank you so much for being here today with us. I appreciate it. I know that the community appreciates the chance to interact and ask you questions. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And if you guys will give me just a second to disconnect with our guest here, I will be back live in just a second. I'm going to give you the cat cam, although my cat is just...